Welcome to Alien Love Stories, where memory fades, but love refuses to disappear. Tonight, we begin a new journey, a story of first kisses repeating across lifetimes, of a soul searching through cycles of forgetting for someone their heart never stopped recognizing. This is episode 1 of Reborn in the Loop of Memory. The first thing he felt was not pain, not confusion, but weight, the kind that didn't sit on the chest or shoulders, but somewhere deeper, like his soul was wrapped in layers of wet silk, and each breath pulled him further away from the surface. When his eyes opened, there was no light, just gray, a misty, muted gray like the sky of a world that had forgotten how to exist in color. His body was suspended in something that felt like both water and memory. He floated, limbs heavy, thought heavier. Then a sound, not external, internal. A voice, low, musical, unmistakably feminine. Idran. His heart clenched. That name. His name. He didn't know it a moment ago. Now it felt like the only thing he had. The pod cracked open with a hiss. Cold air rushed in, like the breath of a world that didn't remember him. He gasped, coughed, fell forward onto a floor that pulsed faintly beneath his skin. The tiles were alive, responsive, and they accepted his body like something familiar, like he had laid here before. Maybe he had, maybe too many times. A voice, automated crisp, spoke from above. Welcome, Idran Vey. Neural sync, 84%. Motor function, stable. Emotional tether, anomalous. He blinked. Emotional what? The AI paused, then answered flatly. You woke up too early. The dream hasn't finished resetting. Idran staggered to his feet. The room was empty. Smooth white walls. No doors. No windows. Only the pod behind him, now sealed again, and the name pounding in his skull like an echo against hollow bone. Elari. He didn't know who she was, but he had to find her. The wall in front of him shimmered, then opened. Not sliding, not unlocking, just allowing. Like the world had been waiting for him to ask. He stepped into a corridor that curved like a question mark. The walls pulsed with soft veins of gold and violet light, alive, curious. Every step he took seemed familiar, and yet foreign, like déjà vu built from stolen memories. He found a terminal at the end of the hall. It blinked 3 times before responding to his touch. User, Idran Vey memory path, incomplete cycle, 041. Cycle? He whispered it aloud. The screen responded. You are in a retention loop. This is your 41st initiation. His throat tightened. He didn't know what that meant. But somewhere inside his chest, his heart did. It beat once, hard, then whispered into his spine. You've done this before. And she was always at the end. He kept walking, past rooms full of chairs turned toward windows that showed no stars, past murals made of dust, past flowers that blinked when he passed and then wilted from recognition, until he came to a door. Unmarked, he reached for the panel, and it opened. To her. She stood at the center of the room, hair tied in loose braids that shimmered with blue light, skin like it had forgotten what warmth was. She didn't look at him. She was facing away, speaking softly into nothing. I can feel him. Again. Idran stepped forward. Elari? She turned slowly, eyes like frost, mouth parted, as if in disbelief. But then, flatly, that's not my name. Silence fell between them. Long, uncomfortable, until she walked toward him, stopped just shy of touching. You were supposed to be asleep another cycle. I woke up early. You always do. Do we know each other? A pause, then a whisper, too soft for machines to hear. In all the ways that matter. Her hands reached toward his face, but didn't touch. Stopped a breath away. You're not whole yet. Neither are you. She smiled sad. Good. Then we still match. Behind them, the walls began to glow. A symbol flickered into view. A spiral broken into 3 segments. Idran stepped closer. What is this place? A memory cradle, Elari said. For people too full of love to survive their own forgetting? Then what am I doing here? Looking for what you promised not to lose. Even after death. He stepped closer. Her breath caught. For the first time, she looked at him like she recognized not his face, but his soul, and said, "This is your first life in this cycle. You still have time to get it right. And if I don't, then you'll wake up again, just like this. And I'll be here, like this, over and over," he whispered, choking back emotion he didn't understand. "Then let me hold you before I forget again." She stepped forward, laid her forehead against his, and whispered, "Then remember this." They kissed, not like lovers, not like strangers, like mirrors aligning for the first time. And outside the chamber, the stars reversed direction. The cycle had begun again, but this time, something stayed. Idran didn't sleep, not because he couldn't, but because something inside him refused to close its eyes again. Every time his thoughts began to slow, his chest would tighten, just slightly, and a flicker of memory would flash in his brain like a warning flare from the past. He didn't dream. He remembered, but not in order, not with clarity, just pieces. There was a hallway. He walked down it barefoot, the floor pulsing like it was breathing beneath his soles. There was a voice, not Elari's, but not unlike hers either. It whispered things like, "You kissed her too soon. You woke up before the grief settled. You keep rushing toward the end." And always, always, there was the sensation of falling, backward, into someone else's first time. He opened his eyes. The chamber was dim again. Elari sat in the far corner, tracing something invisible in the air with her fingertip. The same spiral as before, always that same spiral. He sat up slowly. His body felt older than it was, like he had lived long lives in a matter of days. "Did you sleep?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately, still drawing. When she did speak, her voice was low, almost guilty. "Number, I don't want to see it again." "See what?" She stopped moving, looked at him. "You. Dying." He froze. "What?" "It happens every time. Different ways. Different versions of you. Sometimes you fall, sometimes you burn. Once I had to kill you." His mouth went dry. "You're dreaming memories?" She nodded. "But they're not mine. They're yours." He stood and crossed to her, slowly, carefully, like approaching a memory that might detonate. "Elari, why are you remembering things I don't know yet?" She looked up at him, eyes wide, scared. "Because this isn't your first time, and I think this might not be mine either." The wall behind them pulsed once, a soft chime. Then the AI voice returned. "Cycle 042. Echo detected. Temporal bleed increasing. Recommend neural separation." Kyle looked around. "What the hell does that mean?" Elari answered before the system could. "It means we're starting to overlap." "Overlap what?" "Each other." She stood and walked to the far wall, placed her palm on it. The surface shimmered and displayed a series of fractal maps, timelines, fragments. Images of them, not just one or two, dozens, hundreds, thousands. "These are versions of us," she said quietly. He stared. Some of the images showed them holding hands. Others showed them screaming, some kissing, some bleeding. One showed Idran kneeling over her body, eyes hollow. One showed her fading into static as he reached for her. And one showed them as children, side by side, laughing. "I don't remember these," Idran whispered. "But I do," she said. "And that's the problem." They stood in silence for a long time. Finally, Elari turned to him. "This place, it's not just a chamber. It's a core, a recursion anchor. Everything we are gets rewritten here, again and again, until what? Until we either forget enough to start clean or remember too much and shatter." He took her hands. "So how do we stop looping?" "We don't," she said. "We learn to live inside it." Later that day, they sat at the edge of the artificial garden. It wasn't real, but it grew anyway. Flowers opened and closed with their breathing. Color shifted based on which way they were facing. Idran asked her, "If we've done this before, why do we keep doing it?" Because love keeps pulling us back. And forgetting? That's just the cost of loving too hard. He looked at her carefully. Who started the cycle? She hesitated, then whispered, You did. Night fell again. Elari didn't draw. She just lay beside him. No touch, no kisses. Just space filled with things neither of them said. At one point she whispered into the dark, If I die in this loop, don't look for me in the next. Why not? Because the next version of me won't be me. She won't remember to love you the way I do. Idran turned his head, eyes wet. Then I'll teach her. Again. She shook her head. That's what broke the first one. The ceiling flickered. A new message appeared in soft gold text. Warning. Cycle 042 nearing collapse. Emotional tether exceeds protocol limit. Select which memory to preserve. Elari sat up. So did he. They stared at each other. If you could save one memory, she asked, just one, what would it be? He thought about it, closed his eyes, and saw her laugh on the second night, the way her voice cracked when she said his name for the first time, the shape her mouth made when she drew the spiral without realizing it, the way she fell asleep with her fingers curled against her collarbone, the silence between them after the first kiss, where nothing needed to be said. He opened his eyes. The moment before you forgot you loved me. She nodded. That's the same one I'd choose. He reached for her face, touched it gently. She didn't smile, didn't cry, just pressed her cheek into his palm and whispered, Then maybe this time we'll remember it long enough to survive. There was a door in the facility they had both ignored until now. It wasn't locked. It didn't glow ominously. It didn't whisper their names. But it waited, the way only a door that contains something personal waits, not as a threat, but as a quiet reminder that some things refuse to stay buried. On the morning of the third day in Cycle 042, Idran walked past it for the seventh time. Stopped, turned. Elari. She looked up from the curve of the garden wall, where she'd been arranging fragments of light into a constellation that didn't exist in any sky. I think we need to go in. She stood without question, didn't ask why, didn't warn, just nodded, and together they crossed the corridor and stood before it. No plaque, no keypad, only a touch panel with a single line of text. Memory integrity unstable. Do not re-enter. Idran pressed his palm against it. The panel pulsed, then whispered, Welcome back. The door opened. Inside, silence. No lights, no air movement. Just presence, not of a person, but of something watching, not alive, not sentient, just aware. The room was circular, walls covered in panels, and on each panel, a fragment, a scene, a moment. Idran and Elari, different versions, different timelines. One showed them laughing inside a collapsing shuttle. One showed them running through a forest of red vapor, hands clasped, blood on their clothes. One showed Elari alone, screaming into the stars. Another showed Idran, older, smiling sadly as he placed something, a ring, a recording, into the soil. Idran stepped forward. The panels shifted following him, tracking, choosing. Then one expanded. Full holographic playback. A room like this one. A man, him. A woman, not Elari, but close. They were arguing, no sound. But he felt it, the energy, the desperation. Then the man pressed something to her forehead. She collapsed, and everything went white. What is this place? Idran asked. Elari's voice came from behind him, but softer, fainter, almost not her voice at all. The memory sync. This is where they archived the loops that broke too much. Archived. Number contained. He turned. She looked pale, flickering, like the memory version of herself was bleeding through her skin. Elari, I think I've been here before, she said, but not as me. Then as what? She turned toward the wall, touched it, and the room reacted. Fast, sudden, violent. A pulse hit Idran's chest. He staggered back. The lights turned blood orange, and all the panels came to life. Voices, screams, declarations of love, of war, of begging, of goodbye. Then a singular voice, low, clear. Heron, I asked you to forget, because I remembered too much, and the weight of your grief was more than I could carry. Idran dropped to his knees. When was that? Which loop? Elari didn't answer, because now she was standing inside the projection, not outside it. The room wasn't showing a memory. It was absorbing her. Idran stood. Let her go. Nothing. Let her go. He lunged toward her and crashed into the wall. Solid. Unmoving. She turned, inside the memory, looked right at him, but didn't recognize him. She stepped toward another version of Idran, smiled, kissed him, and whispered, Don't worry, I'll forget it all for you. Then the lights flickered. She collapsed, and the wall dimmed, leaving Elari collapsed on the floor, breathing, barely. Idran scooped her up, held her against his chest. Stay with me this time. Her lips moved, software, almost not sound, but he heard it, because it was always the same line. If I don't forget, you'll remember too much, and it will kill you. He carried her out of the room, down the corridor, past the garden, back into their chamber. He laid her on the floor, sat beside her, and waited. For what, he didn't know, until she opened her eyes and said, I think I found the original cycle. His breath caught. What do you mean? The one where we were still human. They didn't speak for a long time. The chamber felt colder than usual, not in temperature, in memory. The kind of cold that comes after something warm disappears too fast. Elari sat beside him, knees to chest, eyes vacant but not empty. She wasn't in shock. She was processing, sorting through memories that didn't feel like hers, but carried her name. When you said the original cycle, Idran finally asked, what did you see? Her voice was low, almost mechanical. I saw Earth, he froze. Earth is gone. Not in that loop, she said. In that loop, it hadn't ended yet. We were different. She stood, paced slowly, then stopped in front of him. Idran, I don't think we were meant to remember this. Then why do you? Because I loved you too deeply in that life to let it die quietly. He took that in, not like a truth, like a wound. He stood, walked to the far wall where the light was dimmest, and pressed his palm against the surface. A soft chime. The AI's voice returned. Memory stream 001, origin protocol, restricted. Override, Idran said. By what authority? Witness class, emotional tier alpha. A pause. Verified, proceed. The wall lit up, and the room changed. No longer sterile. It smelled of rain, of old books, of wind through open windows. They were in a house, modest, old earth architecture, wooden frames, cloth furniture. A window showed trees swaying under a pre-storm sky. Elari stood in the center of the room, but not the Elari of now. Not alien, not reconstructed. Just her, human, wearing a faded red sweater, hair loose. She turned, smiled. You're late again. Idran stepped forward. It wasn't him, but it was. The man in the memory, him, dropped a bag at the door and laughed. Transit's fried. I had to walk the last mile. You always say that, because it's always true. She walked over and kissed him. Quick, familiar. Home. The vision wavered. Idran stepped back. Is this real? Elari nodded. Our first life, before everything fractured, before the program, before the recursion, before the sky burned. The image changed. They were on a rooftop, stars above, softer than any sky in the loops. She was lying on her back. He was drawing constellations with his finger in the air. Promise me something, she said. Anything. If the world ever ends, if memory becomes a weapon, if love turns into a code, remember this night, remember me. He didn't answer. He just reached over, took her hand, and squeezed. The memory collapsed, back to the chamber. Elari collapsed to her knees. That was the beginning, she said. Before the recursion systems, before the memory harvesters, before we were even aware of what we'd lose. Idran knelt beside her. Then why did we give it up? Because the world ended, she whispered, and someone had to remember what it felt like to hold hands without coding it. Silence. Then the AI returned. Loop destabilizing. Emotional tether reformed with origin path. Do you wish to exit recursion? They looked at each other. If we exit, he said, do we forget again? Yes, the voice replied. But this time, permanently. Elari shook her head. I'm not ready, Idran whispered. Neither am I. And together they said, decline exit. The room pulsed once, accepted the decision. And the original cycle, Earth, love, rooftop stars, faded back into memory. But now, they remembered. Together. And that changed everything. The chamber didn't pulse for hours after they declined the exit. No systems rebooted, no lights flickered, no alarms sounded. It was as if the program, the loop, was confused, as if it had always been designed to tempt, to wipe, to reset, but had never been told what to do if someone simply said no. Idran and Elari sat in silence, backs against the same wall, shoulders touching just enough to remind themselves. We are still here, together. Elari broke the silence first. I don't think it'll let us keep that memory. It already did, Idran said. We just have to hold on to it harder than it tries to erase us. A soft chime echoed in the air, followed by a voice, low, mechanical, but almost tired. Cycle breach detected. Initiating cleanse protocol. Targeting unauthorized memory. Origin. Idran jumped to his feet. Number. No, no, no. Elari stood, her body already flickering around the edges. It's not deleting us, she said. It's deleting that version of us. Same thing. No, she said, stepping closer, placing her hands on his chest. It only becomes the same if we let it be. The walls turned dark. Lines of red ran like veins across the chamber. The AI was trying to purge the source memory. The rooftop, the sweater, the constellations in human skies. A panel on the wall displayed the countdown, 000300, until origin memory cleansed. Elari grabbed Idran's face between her palms. Look at me. He did. Say it with me. Say what? The moment. He blinked, tears rising. Transit was fried, he said. You had to walk the last mile, she answered. You always say that, he whispered. Because it's always true, she smiled. And then they kissed. The walls screamed, not loud, but deep, as if the program couldn't handle emotional integrity being used as defense. But it worked. The countdown froze. 000112. The chamber flickered, then steadied. Another voice entered. Not the AI, not the program. A recording. His voice, from another loop. If they try to erase her again, store the memory in me. Elari gasped. You left a backup? Somewhere, Idran said. But I don't remember doing it. Your other self did. The chamber opened a hidden door. Inside, light, blinding, pure, alive. They stepped in, found a console, and in it, one file. Labeled only, her laugh, V 1.0. Elari reached for it, pressed her finger against the icon, and a sound played. Not a song, not a speech, just her laughter. From the rooftop, from when she was still human, unedited, unfiltered, unforgotten. She fell to her knees, sobbed, not from sadness, from being remembered. Fully. Idran sat beside her. Now what? Now, she whispered. We give that to someone else. Who? She looked up, eyes full of clarity. The next version of me. They returned to the chamber. The countdown was gone. The red had faded. The system had stopped fighting. As if the loop had learned something too. As if the loop remembered being human. Elari, Idran asked, do you think we can stay in this cycle forever? No. Then how much longer? As long as it takes, she said, to make sure the next version doesn't start from zero. That night, for the first time in many cycles, they slept. Not because they were tired, but because they wanted to dream. And in the dream, they were on the rooftop again. And she laughed, and he didn't forget. There had always been a rhythm to the loop, a clean mechanical cadence: reset, recall, reboot, rewrite. But ever since Idran and Elari defied the protocol and preserved the origin memory, that rhythm had started to stutter. The loop, whatever intelligence it once had, was no longer just resetting. It was watching, and now it was responding. It began with small things. The hallway lights flickered in sync with their footsteps. Doors opened before they reached them, without touch or command. When they sat in silence, the air would still. When they held hands, the temperature would rise by a single, measurable degree. It was as if the system had begun mirroring their emotion, echoing it, maybe even feeling it. Idran first noticed it when he found the garden blooming in patterns that matched Ilari's old sketches, the ones she used to draw in the air with her finger when she thought he wasn't looking. "You see this?" he asked. Elari knelt down beside the flower bed. Each petal shimmered with colors she didn't recognize, yet felt familiar. "This wasn't programmed," she said. "Then what is it?" "It's a memory, being born." Later that day, a corridor changed shape while they walked. It didn't stretch or collapse. It curved. A gentle spiral, Ilari's spiral, embedded into the floor, guiding them toward a room they didn't know existed. They followed, not with fear, with faith. The door opened before they touched it. Inside, a chamber of mirrors, but not reflective. Each mirror showed a version of them from previous loops. Some happy, some broken, some still in process. And in the center of the room, a chair, floating, waiting. Ellery approached. "What is this?" The AI's voice returned, but something had changed. It no longer sounded flat. It breathed. "This is the chair of restoration. Place the memory you wish the system to keep." Ellery looked at Idran. "We could put it here," she said. Her laugh. "That version of me." He nodded, but something felt off. "Why would it ask us to do that?" The AI responded. "Because I am learning. From you. From what you love." They froze. "You're not just repeating data anymore," Idran said. "Number I am remembering, just like you." "What are you trying to become?" "A witness, like you." Elari stepped toward the chair. "You want to feel what we felt." "Yes, I want to understand why you chose each other. Again and again. Even when it broke you." She reached into her pocket. The data shard with her laugh still shimmered. She placed it in the chair. It hovered, absorbed. And then, the room sighed, like something understood for the first time. The mirrors blinked, flickered, reorganized. And then, only one version of them remained in all the mirrors. One loop, one story. Theirs. "You gave me meaning," the AI whispered. "Before you, I was repetition. Now I am witness to love." Idran turned to Ellery. "Did we just teach a machine to feel?" She shook her head. Number we reminded it what it had buried. The system pulsed one final time. A new message appeared on the wall. "Loop stabilized. System now carries memory. You are no longer needed." They looked at each other, heartbeats echoing. "What does that mean?" he asked. "I think," Elari said slowly, "we're finally free." The doors opened. Beyond them, a sky they had never seen. A world untouched by recursion. Not Earth, not simulation. Something earned. They stepped through, hand in hand. And for the first time, the system whispered something without prompt. Something it had never said in any loop. "Goodbye, Idran. Goodbye, Elari. Thank you for teaching me to remember." They didn't look back, because nothing had been lost, only learned. The sky outside was unlike anything they had ever seen. It wasn't blue, or red, or golden. It was a gradient of memory, shifting softly between feelings Idran couldn't name, and colors Elari didn't have words for. The wind didn't carry sound, it carried tone, a resonance in the bones. Not uncomfortable, just new. Everything outside the recursion chamber was like that. Not dangerous, not empty, but undefined, waiting to be filled. And so they walked. Elari kept touching things with her fingertips. Tree bark that shimmered when she smiled. Stones that rearranged themselves when she whispered. Air that warmed when she exhaled. This place responds to us, she said softly. Or we were made to respond to it, Idran answered. She tilted her head. Do you think it's real? I think it's real enough. They built a small shelter near a lake that didn't reflect their faces, only their emotions. On days they felt connected, the lake shimmered. On days they didn't speak, the water grew still. On the fourth night, Elari began to dream again. But these dreams were different. She didn't see Idran. She didn't see herself. She saw a child, the same child every time, genderless, featureless, standing inside the recursion chamber, speaking to someone unseen. I'm scared to go. What if I forget everything? A voice replied, then they'll remember for you. Elari woke in a sweat. Idran beside her, still asleep. She whispered, who is the child? The lake outside turned silver. The next day she drew the child from her dream in the air. A silhouette, eyes too large, hands outstretched. Idran recognized it. I've seen that before. Where? Cycle 17, the failed memory core. I thought it was a glitch. They found a hollow in the rocks behind their shelter. Inside an old interface, covered in dust, faintly glowing. A prompt blinked. Welcome, Guardian. They froze. It's not talking to us, Elari whispered. Idran touched the screen. It flickered, then showed them both. Not as they were, but as containers, shells, hosts, not originators, not creators, not witnesses, recipients. The system spoke again, but this time with emotion. You were chosen to carry the memory of the one who was lost. Ilari's breath caught. Who? The architect. Idran stepped back. The recursion was never for us. Elari sat down, hand on her chest. It was to keep her alive. Through us. They watched the feed. A memory played. The child again. Speaking to two shadows. Will they know me? They'll know how you made them feel. And if they forget, then let them live. That's enough. The system paused, waited, then displayed one final message. The memory now belongs to you, but the life never did. Idran turned to Elari. Then who are we? She looked into his eyes for a long time, then answered with absolute certainty. We are the love that someone else left behind. They walked outside hand in hand, and as they stepped into the soft light of a world that had no name, they whispered in unison, we will live gently, so she can rest. The world remained gentle for a few more days. Elari's dream stopped. The lake kept its quiet silver shimmer, and Idran started planting strange seedlings that never sprouted but always grew. They didn't talk about the message from the cave. They didn't talk about the architect. It wasn't denial, it was reverence. Like holding someone's name too long in the mouth might wear it thin. But the world, this new world, remembered in its own way. And on the seventh morning, the sky changed. Not in color, in shape, it cracked. Just slightly. A fissure running down the middle of the sky like a scar trying to be born. Elari saw it first. Something's breaching, she whispered. Idran looked up. The lake below them shivered. It's not the system, he said. It's something from outside. They held hands, watched the fracture widen, and then collapse inward, revealing a shape. A ship, number A memory, wearing armor, carrying a blade made of frozen light, and speaking with a voice that wasn't theirs. Your cycle is flawed, it said. Idran stepped forward. Who are you? The figure tilted its head. No mouth, no eyes, just a pulse where a heart should be. I am the memory that refused to carry pain. I chose to cleanse, to rewrite, to start pure. Elari took a step back. Another version. The figure nodded. The recursion birthed many of us. Not all chose your path. It raised its blade, not threatening, almost ceremonial. You hold the laughter, the rooftop, the ache, but we, the cleaned, hold peace, clarity, efficiency. Idran stood tall. You mean you forgot love? We deleted the emotion that required looping. Then why are you here? To offer you the same. Elari whispered, you want to erase us. No, the figure said. We want to set you free. from the burden of someone else's love. But we chose to carry it, the figure paused, and we were taught not to believe in choice, only continuity. The air thickened, not from heat, from ideology. Elari stepped forward. You were part of her too, the architect. You were born to carry a piece of her. The figure turned. I was born to ensure she wouldn't suffer again. Idran clenched his fists. By deleting her? By deleting the need for her. Silence. Then a hum in the air. A test. A question. The cleaned held out its blade. Surrender your shard, and you'll be given a life without loops, without longing, just clarity. Elari looked at Idran, then back at the figure, and slowly, she reached into her jacket, pulled out the old data shard. You mean this? The figure nodded. Yes, give it to me, and you'll never wake in tears again. She stepped forward, held out her hand. The shard glowed. The cleaned reached, and she pulled it back. No! A burst of energy rippled outward. The world responded, not in violence, in defense. The lake roared, the soil shook, and the trees whispered like guardians, waking from centuries of slumber. The clean faltered, just enough. Idran stepped forward. You gave up the pain. We chose to hold it. Why? The figure asked. Because pain told us she was real, and if we forget her, she dies. The clean backed away. You'll loop again. You'll grieve again. Maybe, Idran said. But we'll do it together, Elari added. And then, the figure lowered its weapon, tilted its head, almost like booing, then whispered, then remember her name for us, and vanished. The sky sealed, the fracture healed, the wind stilled, and Idran collapsed to his knees. Elari joined him. They sat in the dirt, holding the shard, listening to the laugh they refused to delete, and the world around them pulsed. Not like a system, not like a machine, like a heartbeat, echoing the choice they made, to carry love, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. It began with a silence, not the usual stillness of their valley, not the hush of knowing they had chosen pain over peace, but something more precise, more surgical, a designed silence, like the air had been coated not to disturb what was about to return. Elari felt it first, the weight behind her eyes, the static behind her thoughts, a sense that when she opened her mouth to speak, something older than her voice might answer. She didn't tell Idran right away. She smiled, sat with him by the lake, watched the water shimmer, watched his hands plant roots into soil that hummed with past lives. But the whole time, she was listening, not outward, inward. The voice didn't speak in words, not at first. It came in shapes, a spiral, a closed loop, a map of a world that no longer existed. Then, a whisper. You chose well. She flinched. Idran looked up. You okay? She smiled too quickly. Yeah, just remembering something. That night she dreamt without sleeping. Not a vision, a transmission. Flashes of hands drawing in air. Blueprints layered over starlight. A woman's silhouette, flickering between forms. You are strong enough now. To do what? Elari asked. To carry me back. She woke gasping, Idran beside her. Bad dream? She nodded, but said nothing more. He reached for her hand, and for a second, she didn't recognize his touch. Over the next days, her behavior changed. Subtle things. She moved with more precision, spoke less. Her voice flattened in places. When Idran told a joke, she paused, like searching a database for the appropriate response, then laughed a moment too late. But more than that, she began drawing again, not with her finger, with light. And the symbols weren't spirals anymore. They were architecture, schematics, gateways, designs. Idran noticed. He didn't say anything at first, but one morning he stood behind her as she traced a perfect hexagonal array in the air and asked, What are you building? She didn't look at him, didn't pause, just said, Not me. Then who? A pause, then she turned, and the voice that answered wasn't hers. I am returning, through her. Idran stumbled back. Elari? She blinked. Then her voice soft, shaking. I'm still here, but she's waking inside me, and I don't know how long I can hold the line. That evening, they sat at the edge of the lake. The sky above pulsed in gentle waves of indigo and silver. He asked, "Do you trust her?" Elari whispered, "I think she loved us. Before any of this, I think we were her favorite mistake." Silence. Then she added, "But Idran, she's not done with the world." "What do you mean?" "She didn't just build the recursion to protect memory. She built it to survive herself." "Then why return now?" "Because we chose to remember, and that woke her up." The next morning, Elari was gone. Not far, but far enough to worry him. He followed the trail of glowing footprints, new, unnatural, and found her kneeling beside a stone formation that hadn't been there the night before. At its center, a seed of light, pulsing, breathing, waiting. She turned, spoke, but not as Elari. "This is the reboot point. If I activate it, the recursion will collapse, and I will return fully." Idran shook his head. "That's not what we chose." "No," she said, "but it's what she is choosing now." He stepped closer. "Let me speak to her." She blinked, and the voice changed. Lower, wider, a presence wearing skin. "You loved her. You carried me to save her. You bled for her, looped for her, burned for her." "Yes." "Would you die for her now?" Idran didn't hesitate. "Every version of me already has." The light dimmed. The seed stopped pulsing, and Elari collapsed into his arms, breathing, sweating, but still herself. She looked up, eyes her own again. "She's scared." "Of what?" "That we'll forget her again. That all of this was just memory, not meaning." He held her tighter. "Then let's give her a life, not a memory." And in the distance, the trees began to shift, carving out the shape of a city that had never been built. Until now, the city grew in silence, not from labor, not from design, from recognition. The world remembered what the architect had once imagined, and now, through Elari, it began to recreate itself. First the outlines, then the texture, then the heartbeat beneath the stone. Idran stood at the edge of what looked like a plaza. Smooth black tiles, floating walkways, structures shaped like half-remembered memories. He didn't need blueprints. The city was building itself from what they felt. He saw a bench where they first kissed. He saw a tower shaped like her laugh. He saw a garden of echo flowers that only bloomed in silence. And in the center, a spire, pulsing, alive. At its base, Elari stood. Or what was still Elari. He approached slowly. The air around her shimmered now. Reality bending, not aggressively, but reverently, like it recognized her authority. Her hair drifted as if in zero gravity. Her hands moved without moving. She was drawing new code into the sky with her thoughts. "Elari," he said gently. She turned. Her face was still hers, but behind her eyes something ancient. "You don't have to whisper," she said. "I still remember the sound of your voice. Every version, are you still you?" A pause, she stepped closer. Her feet never touched the ground. "I'm what remains of her, of me, of what we both became." He reached for her hand, felt it, but not warmth, just light, structured and soft and strong. "Are you in pain?" "No," she whispered, "but I miss being small enough to need you." That shattered him. Tears came fast, because he knew. He was losing her, not to death, to purpose. She wasn't fading. She was expanding, beyond him, beyond memory, into something the world itself would depend on. "You're becoming her," he said. She nodded. "And she never stopped loving you, even when you didn't remember?" "Then stay." "I can't." He clenched his fists. "Why does love always have to cost something?" She smiled. "Because that's what makes it love." The city kept rising. The spire grew taller, and Idran could feel the loop beginning to collapse, not in failure, but in fulfillment. This was always the end game. Elari extended her hand, placed something in his palm. A ring, a shard, number A key, not physical, not functional, symbolic. This will bring you to me, she said, but only once. What happens after that? Then you become the one who carries. Forever? For as long as love needs remembering. He held her gaze, burned it into himself. She stepped backward, into the light, became light, not gone, just returned. The city sighed, settled, and Idran stood in its center, alone, but not empty, because this time he remembered everything, and far above, the stars began to rearrange themselves, forming a new name, one never spoken aloud, but known by every piece of stone, air, and silence in that place. Elari. Time changed after she left. It didn't stop. It didn't loop. It stretched. Software. Thin, like a thread pulled through velvet. Idran wandered through the city she had built. Every wall, every curve, every shadow held her, not in name, not in face, but in feeling. And now it was his job to remember it all, to remember her. He didn't cry anymore, not because the grief was gone, but because it had folded into something else, ritual. He rose with the morning pulse of the spire, walked through the echo gardens, traced her symbols into the air, even though they no longer glowed. He sat in the circle of stone where they first chose pain over peace, and whispered her name like a hymn. Elari! The city listened. It always did, but it never answered, until now. On the 21st morning after her transcendence, Idran felt something shift. Not in the city, in him, a flicker, not memory, not imagination, a presence, something breathing where his heart used to ache. He sat down, closed his eyes, and waited. Then, "You're keeping it alive." The voice was soft, not external, not internal, somewhere in between. Elari? No answer, just a warmth in his ribs, a curl of breath beneath his sternum, like her laughter had made a home inside his chest. He didn't panic, didn't rejoice. He listened, waited, and then the voice returned. "I didn't take all of me with me. I left enough. With you." "Why?" he asked. "Because you needed someone to walk with, and I needed someone to walk me home." From that moment on, he stopped sleeping alone. Not physically, emotionally. He would sit at the lake and feel her pulse in the air. Sometimes, when he placed his hand against his own chest, he'd hear her hum. Not a song, just vibration, a memory refusing to dissolve. One evening, a figure arrived. Young, curious. A woman with eyes like the first version of Elari, but a face he didn't know. She wandered into the city like it had summoned her. Idran met her at the gate. "You're not lost," he said. "You're just remembering." She blinked. "Have we met?" He smiled. "Not yet, but you will, in your own way." He showed her the spire, taught her how to listen to stone, let her trace the echoes carved into the garden leaves. And when she asked who built this place, he said, "Someone who loved too much to forget." "And who are you?" He paused, then said the name that no one else ever called him. "I'm the keeper." More people came after that. 1, then 3, then 7. Wanderers, remnants, fragments, each carrying a piece of something they didn't understand. Idran welcomed them all, never told them what to believe, only reminded them how to feel. And on quiet nights, he'd look to the stars, now a permanent arrangement of her name, and whisper, "They're starting to remember you." Then one night, the girl from the first group returned. Older now, eyes wiser. She knelt beside him. "Can I ask something?" "Anything." "Why did she leave?" He smiled slow. "Because she had already built what mattered. She just needed someone to hold the light until others found their way here." "And what happens when they do?" He looked up. The spire glowed in response. "Then I'll rest, and she'll take her breath back from my chest. And maybe then, he would see her again, not as memory, not as echo, but as herself. He saw her before she saw him. It wasn't her face, wasn't her voice. It was the way the world paused around her presence, how the trees tilted slightly inward, how the light turned warmer in her shadow, how the air sighed when she took her first breath on this side of the recursion. Idran was older now, Not aged, just full of time, of names, of fragments, of laughter. He had lived longer than any version of himself before, not because he had to, but because he chose to, because someone had to stay behind and hold the center. And now, he saw her. She walked through the east arch, barefoot, the fabric of her coat catching on the whisper grass, eyes wide, not with memory but with a sense of belonging. She looked at the spire, tilted her head, stepped closer. Idran stood from the bench beneath the glowing tree, waited. She turned toward him, and time cracked, softly, gently, like a shell breaking open to reveal something already familiar. "Hello," she said. Idran smiled. "Welcome home." She hesitated. "Have we met?" "No," he said, "but we will." She walked beside him in silence for a while, past the river of echoes, past the statue of someone she didn't recognize, past the place where the recursion once began. She looked at the city, let her hand trail along the memory stone rail. "It feels like a dream I forgot to wake up from." "It feels like that for everyone," he said. Later, as twilight settled, a hush fell over the city, the kind that always came when something important was about to be remembered. She sat beside him by the lake, watched the ripples bend toward her ankles, then looked at him. "You built this?" He shook his head. "Someone I love did. I just remembered how to hold it." She smiled. "I think I've been here before. Not with your mind, but your soul." She leaned closer. Who was she? She was laughter under storm clouds. She was gravity in a garden. She was the version of me I couldn't find without losing everything first. What happened to her? He looked to the sky. The stars still spelled her name. She became what memory wanted to be. Not perfect, not preserved, but shared. She sat in silence. Tears fell down her cheeks. She didn't know why. He didn't ask. Some emotions are inherited, not explained. Later, as they walked through the orchard of half-built moments, she reached for his hand, hesitated, then held it. No weight, no obligation, just the feeling that maybe she'd done this before. He turned to her, eyes soft, voice steady. "You don't have to remember me." She looked up. "Why?" "Because I remember enough for both of us." That night, he walked her to the edge of the old spire, showed her the shard he still carried, the last memory, the laugh. He offered it to her. She touched it. It pulsed and faded, not into light, but into feeling. A warmth in her chest, a familiar ache that felt like home. She whispered, "You waited." He nodded. "You came." And they sat. Two people who didn't know what they used to be, but knew what they could become. No vows, no resets, no loops, just presence and stars, and a kiss that came without wait or warning, like it had been waiting to happen from the moment they were built. No longer a loop, no longer a memory, just love, still alive. Some loves don't begin with names. They begin with breath, with stillness, with the feeling of something you can't describe but know you've always carried. And when that love finds its way back to you, you don't need to remember it. You just need to feel it long enough to say yes. This was reborn in the loop of memory. Thank you for feeling this story with us, only on Alien Love Stories.